I'm Dr. Emma Katz, author of the new book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, and today I'll be talking to you about coercive control and its impacts on children. Where there's coercive control, the lives and the freedoms of victims are seriously limited because coercive control involves situations where somebody subjects another person or persons to persistent and wide-ranging controlling behaviour over a long period of time and makes it clear that standing up for themselves will be punished. In other words, do what I say or else. The punishment for standing up for yourself may take many forms. It's not always violence, but it will be something that the abuser knows the victim dreads, such as cruel verbal put-downs, hurting their loved ones, coercing them into unwanted forms of sexual activity, or economically abusing them. By repeatedly punishing the victim for their non-compliance, the perpetrator intends to demoralize and terrorize the victim into a state of permanent obedience. Not all intimate partner, domestic and family violence and abuse involves coercive control. Coercive control is a particularly severe and serious form of abuse. It causes high levels of harm and is a key risk factor for intimate partner femicide. Coercive control is mainly perpetrated by males, although not exclusively so. 97% of the perpetrators convicted for controlling and coercive behaviour in England and Wales in the year ending December 2020 were male. The perpetrator is motivated by their deeply held and harmful drive to obtain control over the other people in their family and maintain that control indefinitely. This is not about passion or about lost tempers. What it's about is the perpetrator believing they are entitled to control others in ways that strip them of their normal rights and liberties. For perpetrators, their drive to control is so strong that it tends to dominate their whole life. Much of their time is spent pursuing, upholding, and enjoying the control they seek, and developing a positive public reputation that will reduce the likelihood that anyone will ever believe or rally around the victims, should the victims come forward and ask for help. The impacts on a family experiencing coercive control will include fear, confusion, self-doubt and self-blame, low self-esteem, trauma, PTSD, depression, anxiety, physical illness, deprivation, the feeling of always walking on eggshells, trying to please the perpetrator, and not being able to exercise self-determination over key areas of their lives. There may also be attempts from victims to fight back, resist, and speak the truth about what is happening, and protect themselves and others in the family from further harm. Here we can see pictures contrasting domestic violence with coercive control. In domestic violence, this involves one person attacking, hitting another person. But with coercive control, it's a bit more complicated than this. So I've got 4 images here that represent coercive control. The first one, the woman who's on a string, become like a puppet. The perpetrator is now controlling her every move. Her actions are no longer her own. She can't make decisions for herself because the perpetrator has her on these strings. The boy looking out at us, scared and anxious. Children are affected by coercive control just as much as adults, as we'll go on to see. Children are constantly assessing the perpetrator's mood, monitoring it, wondering what they can do to stay on the perpetrator's good side. The picture of the mum and her boy on the beach. This is Hannah Clark and her son, Australian coercive control victims. Hannah had never been physically attacked by her husband, so she wasn't sure that she was a domestic abuse victim. But post-separation, he'd been highly controlling of her and the children. Post-separation, he burnt them to death in their car, her and their children. And this picture, I've used it as well because it symbolizes that people who are being coercively controlled will look happy. They will take smiley pictures and you won't necessarily know that anything is the matter, but in private, what is happening to them is incredibly serious. And then the woman in the cage, surrounded by bars, imagine that the bars are all the perpetrator's rules, all the things that he demands that she does or doesn't do and all of the rules that are keeping her entrapped, and she has tape over her mouth. She's been silenced. Coercive control occurs both pre and post separation, and abusers use a number of tools to strip you of your ordinary rights and liberties and make you compliant to them. They use control of time and movement and the micromanagement of the victim's everyday life and self-expression. Imagine that as the hammer in the perpetrator's toolbox of abuse. Emotional abuse, psychological abuse against the victim and their loved ones, including pets, so emotionally and psychologically upsetting the pet to upset the adult or child victim. Manipulation, including through periods of strategic niceness that give the victim false hope that things are going to be okay now, and perhaps make them doubt their perception of how bad things were before. Sexual coerciveness, rape, paranoia about infidelity, intimate image and video abuse, and reproductive coercion. Economic abuse, including interfering with the victim's employment, preventing them from having money or assets, refusing to contribute to bills, creating debts for which the victim is liable, and taking the victim to court vexatiously so that their money is drained by legal proceedings. So all of these, imagine, are tools in the perpetrator's toolbox of abuse. Further tools include isolation from sources of support, including family, friends, communities, and professionals. Perpetrators may react so badly when you reach out to your friends and family that eventually you stop reaching out to them to avoid that negative reaction. Monitoring, harassing, and stalking, including through technology. Manipulating others, including any children in the family, to upset, marginalize, and disempower the victim. Using and manipulating legal processes and institutions and systems to threaten, harm, impoverish, or discredit the victim. And physical violence, physical abuse, intimidation, threats of violence against the victim, against their loved ones, their pets, and their property. This is continual multi-tacticked abuse, not isolated incidents of violence. Professor Evan Stark's book, Coercive Control, The Entrapment of Women in Personal Life, argued that our responses to coercive control-based domestic violence were failing survivors because they wrongly see domestic violence as discrete incidents or episodes of violence. And virtually all domestic violence research and intervention is based on this incidents or episodes of violence model. But this overlooks that coercive controllers are using many other abusive tactics besides physical violence. They're using emotional abuse, monitoring, isolation, stalking, economic abuse, legal abuse, the manipulation of systems and professionals, and they are using these tactics continuously. Survivors are therefore being constantly abused, even if there's not been an incident of physical violence for months or ever. So we must avoid shaping our responses around the history of the violence. We must avoid assuming that the abuse is now over because the last incident of violence was not recent. Instead, we must look more comprehensively at all the tactics the coercive controller is using to carry out their abuse. When a survivor attempts to break free, when they raise concerns about the abuse and seek safety for themselves and their family members, perpetrators typically respond by justifying their behavior, minimizing it, or outright denying that they've ever been abusive at all, and by attempting to turn the blame on the survivor by making counter-accusations against the survivor. Common counter-accusations from the perpetrator in these circumstances include that the survivor has caused the children to dislike the perpetrator and has alienated the children from the perpetrator, that the survivor is crazy in some way, or that the survivor is the violent and abusive one. This tactic is known as DARVO, deny the abuse, attack the credibility and character of the victim, reverse the narrative about who is the victim and who is the offender, and about who is the abusive parent and who is the safe parent for the children. Children are not only harmed by witnessing or being exposed to incidents of physical violence. Children are harmed by the whole regime of coercive control that the perpetrator is imposing on their family. The lives of everyone in the family are greatly distorted and damaged by the regime of coercive control the perpetrator is imposing due to their drive and determination to assert and maintain control. This is the case both pre and post the parents splitting up or divorcing. Family life becomes distorted, and children's and mothers' ordinary behaviours and liberties become limited and shrunken in harmful and distressing ways. Children's and adults' experiences of coercive control are so similar that children can best be understood as co-victims and co-survivors. And in the next 2 slides, we're going to see how every tactic of coercive control harms the children too, starting off with quotes from mothers and children taken from my book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives, which included interviews with mothers and children who'd had these experiences. Firstly, let's look at how the children were harmed before the parents had separated. When Mum was giving me attention, he'd tell her to go over to him, so she'd have to leave me to play by myself. The kids couldn't have any friends round because he'd kick off or something. And kids' parties were another problem because he'd be accusing me of trying to have sexual relations with one of the dads at the party. So parties were out of the question. We couldn't do any after-school clubs because he insisted I had to be back home by a certain time. The clubs finished after that time. Me and the kids weren't allowed to go round to see their grandparents. So here the children, not able to see their friends regularly, not able to join in the after-school clubs, not able to even go and see their own grandparents. I would be sort of quiet, says one boy. I didn't shout out or run around. He'd tell us, me and my son, that we couldn't touch the food in the fridge, that we weren't allowed to eat. He'd lock us in the house a lot of the time so we couldn't get out. If I wanted to go shopping, then I had to take a speaking child with me, and he would ask them where we'd been and what we'd been doing. My son wouldn't do things like make his own sandwich. He'd be too scared of doing it wrong. It got to the point where the kids were talking to me like dirt and ignoring everything I said because that's all they saw from their dad. It was so stressful. Anything I said to the kids, he would override on purpose. I was nothing in that house. Once I got home a few minutes late, he started banging my head against the wall, calling me all these names, saying, "Where have you been, you bitch?" And my daughter Shannon was just shaking like mad and crying. And then post-separation, the harms to children from the abuser continue. He used to bring some other men and try and break into the house. And me and my brothers feared for our lives because he used to smack on the doors and I used to hide. My dad's injunction ran out. He kept turning up at the house. Then he wrote something on the back door. He wrote, "Dead bitch." And my mum tried to get it removed before we could see it, but I saw it before it got removed. During our family court-ordered weekend visits to him, he'd say, "Oh, your mum makes me cry. Your mum makes me do this stuff. I can't see you because of your mum." He'd just paint such a bad picture of her. He blamed her and us for everything. I felt very small and bad. After our weekend visits with our father, my sister Zoe would be off school most Mondays because she felt so ill. She was on the sofa being held by mum and crying. I was just so drained and I felt like crying all the time. The first time I pressed charges with the police, he got a few months for battery and then he got let out after just a few weeks. He started to stalk us. The children and I used to stay out the house and away from him for as long as possible. And then we'd come in, we'd lock the gate, pull the curtains across, lock all the doors, put the alarm on, and then go upstairs out the way. And then we'd just live upstairs and try and get out when we could. This only came to an end when he attacked me again and was arrested again. He's still really putting the children through it emotionally. He told them that if we moved to our new house, they would get shot and stabbed because he said that's what happens in our area, things like that. So he's still really hurting them emotionally. When they come back from contact visits with him, they're awful. Their behaviour is really bad, and normally I'm getting verbally attacked by my son who's having a go at me. So coercive control can best be seen as a multi-stranded type of abuse that occurs in the most serious cases of intimate partner, domestic and family violence and abuse. To quote from my book, Coercive control is a phenomenon that includes many strands of abusive behaviour that harm both adults and children. It encompasses abusive acts towards the victimised parents, abusive acts towards the children that would be categorised as child abuse and neglect, and many other harmful behaviours. Perpetrators usually continue their campaigns of control post-separation, so separation and divorce should not be seen as the end of the abuse. It's very likely the abuser is still abusing, and the adult and child victims and survivors are still being abused post-separation. It is important to note that most women and mothers being targeted by coercively controlling men and fathers, both pre and post-separation, tend to do what they can do to keep their children as safe, well, and happy as possible, though their ability to do this can be limited by the father's determination to abuse in ways that harm the children. If you ask children themselves, their mothers are cited more frequently by children who've lived with domestic abuse as their most important source of help than anyone else in their lives. Their relationship with their mother is most children's major support in coping. So to conclude, coercive control is a severe form of abuse, and perpetrators of coercive control cause high levels of harm. Coercive control perpetrating fathers tend to subject their children to coercive control in ways that directly and profoundly harm the children's day-to-day experience of life. Mothers separating from fathers is unlikely to be enough to make the children safe, as fathers tend to be determined to continue their coercive control post-separation. The problem lies within the perpetrator. Tackling the problem means tackling the perpetrator, holding them accountable, curbing their ability to continue abusing, and helping the adult and the child victims and survivors to be safe, really safe, not just safe on paper, not just safe because a court order claims that they're safe, not just safe because a form that's been filled in says that they're safe, but actually so safe that you can ask them, how do you feel? And they'll be able to reply, I feel safe. That's how safe they need to be. So this is my book, Coercive Control in Children's and Mothers' Lives. Thank you very much for listening. I'm Dr. Emma Katz. Feel free to contact me and follow me on Twitter and Instagram. These are the references that I used today.